Welcome to the Meeple Inc Design Diary, where I'll give you a brief overview of how Meeple Inc came to be, how we moved from this to this. Meeple Inc is a fast-paced worker placement style game for 1 to 6 players set in an alternate 1970s, where meeples are alive and have coexisted with humans for centuries. In Meeple Inc, you take on the role of competing board game publishers vying to create the greatest tabletop games. Meeple Inc, of course, is full of little board game related Easter eggs and some of the coolest components in board gaming, but more on that later. So how did Meeple Inc start? Well, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you may remember the Design Diary series we made for our previous game, Gonza Index. We started that series by saying most games begin with either a theme or a mechanism. Perhaps you have an idea for a new theme that has not been seen before, something which would grab the attention of board gamers everywhere. Board games themselves seem uniquely able to adapt and adjust to almost any theme, from fighting hordes of zombies to quilting and building Portuguese walls. Board games have all sorts of themes, and you just need one that connects with your audience. It really can be anything. I mean, who would have guessed that the biggest game of 2019 would be themed on birdwatching? Then there are the games that start with a mechanism. In this approach, you have a cool idea for a new mechanic you want to try out. The aim is then to find the theme that will best allow you to show this mechanic off to its potential. This is less common than starting with a theme, but a good example of this could be Race for the Galaxy. This game was innovative in its use of simultaneous card play, which drives the game forwards and removes player downtime entirely. Something which is great if you are as impatient about analysis paralysis as I am. So, which approach did we use for Meeple Inc? The answer is actually neither. For Meeple Inc, we started with the components. Someone had shared these images of cute miniature versions of classic games, and the idea came from there. We loved the idea of having tiny little game boxes that you could put up on a tiny board game shelf. It just seemed like such a cool idea for game components. So we then started to think about the theme and mechanisms that could allow this to happen. It's not an approach we've used before, but it actually worked really well. Once we had the starting concept of a game of tiny games, we had to start building the rest of it. We needed a theme and some mechanisms to allow our players to manipulate these tiny tabletop creations. So for the theme, it seemed fairly obvious that a game about designing and producing board games would be the most fun way to do this. Each player would take on the role of a board game publisher or designer and would compete to make the best games. As we are board game publishers ourselves, this also seemed like a theme we'd be in a good place to explore. So we had some components, a theme, and we knew we wanted to make a competitive game. Added to this, we wanted Meeple Inc to play well with a wide player count, as with all the games we create. We also wanted it to be full of interesting decisions, to have limited downtime, and to have at least one completely novel game mechanism. The job then was to find some mechanisms which would fit this brief, and actually very quickly we settled on worker placement as the core of the gameplay. If the game was going to put us in the position of board game publishers, then sending out our workers to complete board game publishing tasks seemed like the most thematic approach. Plus, who doesn't love worker placement games? So we set out to play as many worker placement games as we could for inspiration. Again, if you watch this channel regularly, this is actually something that may sound familiar, as we've already released a whole video on the wonders of the worker placement mechanism. So I won't dwell on them too much here, other than to point out some of the mechanism's highlights. Firstly, worker placement itself is a relatively simple mechanism, and if done right, it can connect to a theme unbelievably well. At its core, worker placement involves placing objects, workers, into a particular space. Usually these are communal and allow you to take a specific action or gain some other bonus. Many tabletop games have themes which require you to oversee workers of some kind, and so having those workers as a resource you can send out to perform specific jobs fits neatly with the resource management goals of many modern board games. And Meeple Inc is no exception. Another benefit of worker placement is it gives clear agency and choice to players with minimal or possibly even zero need for randomness. For example, take Stonemaier Games' modern classic Viticulture, a beautiful game of winemaking in Tuscany. Should I place a worker here to rent out a field for more money, take my chances on getting a season card, buy some new vines, or build up the infrastructure of my vineyard? Each of these distinct choices in viticulture involves just the board and a single worker, and each is a viable and desirable option. Worker placement also has an incredible inherent flexibility to it. It seems like designers can twist, change, and remix the mechanic in an endless series of ways to keep the mechanism feeling fresh and new. In viticulture, there are these hefty grande workers, which can't be blocked, allowing players to always do that one action that is crucial to their plans. In Raiders of the North Sea, the workers themselves are communal to all players, and you take 2 actions on your turn, one when you place a worker, and second when you pick a replacement worker back up. The game has multiple different worker types to add even more interesting decisions. On the other hand, Agricola is interesting as it adds the need to upkeep your workers. So the more you have, the more you need to feed them. And games like Marco Polo and Rajas of the Ganges have removed the classic meeples and instead replaced them with dice, adding in a juicy element of input randomness to the agency of the worker placement. Then in Everdell, you can purchase your own exclusive worker placement spaces that only you can use, and that often gives powerful abilities whilst adding variety into each game. For Meeple Inc, we played around with many variations of these ideas. Early on, we decided that we really liked the element of viticulture, where there are extra bonuses for using some worker placement spaces sooner than others, so we added a bonus into each action space. Along the same lines as Everdell, we added the ability for players to purchase their own unique worker placement spaces. In Meeple Inc, this took the form of hiring freelancers to your publishing corporation. We then built on the idea from Raiders of the North Sea of having multiple worker types. So in Meeple Inc, these novel workers acted as specialists in the game. Each specialist would relate to one of the 15 different actions in the game, and if you use a specialist worker on its corresponding action, you could gain powerful bonuses. These specialists, along with the freelancers, allow players to build up a powerful engine of abilities throughout games of Meeple Inc. We made sure to add in a wide variety of specialists and freelancers, which meant that each game could end up feeling very different. Taking inspiration from the legacy game Charterstone, we decided to move away from the traditional phased approach to worker placement. Many worker placement games ask players to take turns placing workers onto spaces in rounds, and then ask players to collect back their workers at the end of the round. In Charterstone, players can retrieve their workers whenever they want, which minimises any first player advantage, and we found this roundless approach flows better than a phased one. However, the downside is that the advantage to having extra workers is lessened. So to combat this, we added some more reasons to hire new workers. The specialist abilities I mentioned earlier, for example, do this really well. And we also built a benefit into the timer of the game itself. We decided that each time you retrieve your workers, we'd ask players to move the timeline token one space forward for each worker they retrieved. And to make this more exciting, we also filled the timeline with juicy bonuses. As you move the timeline token, which is the lovely hourglass miniature, you cross over these bubbles, each containing a benefit. When the timer reaches 0, the game is over. And the great part about this approach is that we had a lot of control over how long games would last. Meeple Inc is at heart an engine-building game, so we wanted players to feel a sense of progression throughout the game, and then for games to end just as their engine is reaching its zenith. Like Sid Meier's Civilization series, the feeling in games of Meeple Inc should always be a strong desire to take just one more turn. Having the number of workers you retrieve directly affecting the timeline of the game gives us the ability to ensure this happens in every game of Meeple Inc. One potential downside of this approach is that you have to take a turn to retrieve your workers. This is not a particularly fun thing to do, as you don't get to progress your game by retrieving workers, it's placing them that's the fun part. So we tried to think of a way to fix this. The first we already mentioned, when you move the timeline and you can get powerful bonuses, but we also added a brand new mechanism at this point. Predictions. One common problem we have found with worker placement games is that outside of blocking your opponents, there is often little reason to focus on the gameplay of your fellow players. They can't influence you too much, nor you them, and whilst this multiplayer solitaire style play is common in Euro-style board games and not necessarily a problem, we wanted Meeple Inc to be a game with lots of player interaction, where you were continually invested and aware of your opponent's plans. We achieved some of this with the use of limited resources, which has worked well in many worker placement games. The locations you place your workers are communal and limited, but so too are the specialists and freelancers you hire, the awards you can win, and the items available to you in the item track. All players are playing in the same pool with the same resources, so they are therefore interested in the actions of their opponents. But we didn't think it was quite enough, so we asked ourselves a question. What is the most interesting way to encourage a player to pay attention to their opponents? The solution we came to was quite simple. We could reward them for doing this, and our prediction mechanism was born. The prediction mechanism works like this. When you retrieve your workers after you've moved the timeline and collected your bonuses, you then have the opportunity to make predictions about your opponents. You must publicly declare which opponent you are making predictions about by using the corporation card, but then you can select up to 4 actions you think they'll make before you next retrieve your workers. You then get 2 victory points for each correct prediction you make. It's a fairly simple addition, but it adds a lot of new, intriguing elements to the gameplay. Firstly, it adds considerably to the power of hiring new workers. Your predictions last until you take your workers back again, so the more workers you have, the longer your predictions have to come true. It also adds more nuance to the hiring and use of specialists. Specialists are powerful workers with an ability in one specific action, but that power makes you a little more predictable to your opponents, who will expect you to use it, and could take advantage of this to correctly predict your actions and benefit themselves. Now, we didn't want these predictions to ever feel negative though, so nothing bad happens to a player who has a correct prediction made about them. Instead, their opponent has something good happen to them. They gain victory points. You must also pay valuable research tokens for each prediction you make, so the more you make, the more expensive it is and also the higher the risk. You see, all your predictions must come true for you to achieve those juicy, satisfying, devilishly delicious victory points. This added an interesting push your luck element to the game that we really liked. As predictions cost resources and are 100% optional, it kept in the player agency. Players could choose to make lots of predictions or none at all. Both are perfectly valid strategies in the game. As with all our games, there are many paths to success in Meeple Inc, and which to take will vary from game to game. There are many more interesting elements to the gameplay of Meeple Inc, from how workers are added to these little gaming tables, to how you can build and publish your own games, and win these awards. So if you're interested to know more about how it all works, we have a full how to play video linked in the description. But for now, let's move on to the artwork of Meeple Inc. The artwork was actually one of the last elements to be added to the game. We knew the theme would be creating board games, and the gameplay was ironed out carefully over many playtesting sessions, but we struggled to think of an art style that we thought the game deserved. That was until we found Ed. Ed specialises in vintage comic book style art, and we immediately fell in love with his style. Meeple Inc was a game of board game creation in an alternate reality where meeples are real. They're not real? Wait, what? As such, we decided that it made sense for the modern board gaming revolution to have happened much earlier in history. We settled in the 1970s, and Ed's artwork could bring this world to life. This alternate timeline also allowed us to make up a whole series of board game designs people could make in the game, which excitingly allowed us to fill the game with little board game related Easter eggs. We could nod to some of our favourite themes from board games, or even just a not so subtle reference to specific games we love. Once the art was in place, we could finalise the element of the game we started with: the components. We decided that we'd have 2 versions of the game. The base game, which would be everything you needed to enjoy the gameplay, and a deluxe version that could enhance the components as a reward for those who back our crowdfunding campaign. This means there is a budget-friendly option which misses out nothing gameplay-wise, but also the option to deluxify your tabletop experience to the max. The base game is still full of excellent components. The mini board games come as standard, as do the triple-layer board gaming tables. Did I mention they have felt inserts? And the hourglass miniature. But for the deluxe version, we decided to upgrade many of the punchboard elements from the base game. These standees became these beautiful acrylic models. The resource tokens were upgraded to screen-printed wood, the trophy tokens became these beautiful golden metal sculptures, and the punchboard gaming shelf was replaced by this rather impressive miniature wooden alternative. And for those looking to go even further, we even developed some add-ons with real metal hexagonal coins, card sleeves, and even miniature wooden gaming tables. We had so much fun making Meeple Inc that we even developed a full expansion for it. The Golden Pair expansion allows you to attend board game conventions in this alternate reality and to compete for the attention of the greatest influencers in the hobby, which of course is another chance for us to add some not so subtle Easter eggs. This time, some nods to some of our favourite board game content creators. And check out these gorgeous metal Golden Pair award tokens. But I'll talk more on this expansion in a later video. The total process from seeing the tiny classic games to finally being able to release the game on GameFound has taken us well over 3 years of design, development, and countless hours of work and playtesting, but we are so pleased with the final result. All we need now is a successful campaign to fund printing and Meeple Inc can become a reality. So if the game sounds of interest to you, then please follow along with our campaign using the link in the description below. We genuinely cannot make our games without backers, and so we'd really appreciate your support. Get ready, Meeple Inc is coming to GameFound on March the 5th. See you there.